So imagine you're walking into this legendary, centuries-old restaurant.
Oh, right. The kind of place everyone has heard about.
Yeah, exactly. The kind of place famous for a highly specific, super complex family recipe.
Like a dish with distinct, really bold flavors.
Right. It's deeply rooted in the soil of its region, maybe a little spicy, totally unique.
Yeah.
And, it requires a specific palate.
Oh, absolutely. It's not for everyone.
No, but for the people who love it, there is just nothing else like it in the entire world.
Because it demands something of you, right? You don't just consume it passively.
Right.
It is an immersive experience. And because of that, this restaurant has built a profound, fiercely loyal community around its tables over the centuries.
But so time passes, and the current owners, they decide they want to franchise globally.
They want the big numbers.
Exactly. Massive, unprecedented numbers. And to appeal to every possible palate across the globe, to make sure absolutely no one is offended by the spice, or confused by the complex flavor profile, they start tweaking the recipe.
Right, they start watering it down.
Yeah. They remove the bold seasoning, they scrub the historical name from the storefront to something incredibly generic, and eventually, they just start serving plain crackers.
Plain crackers, which, it looks like a brilliant business move at first glance, right?
Well, yeah, everyone can eat a plain cracker.
Exactly. It is the absolute lowest common denominator of food. But the deep irony of this strategy is that in trying to feed everyone, they completely erased the very thing that made them a restaurant worth visiting in the first place.
Wow, yeah.
They gained the masses, but they basically lost their soul.
And that journey, from a rich, complex, historically rooted recipe to a mass market plain cracker, that is the exact theological journey of modern evangelicalism.
It really is.
So, welcome to the Deep Dive. We are thrilled you're here with us. You are the ultimate learner, and our mission today is looking at a massive stack of historical, theological, and sociological data.
And literary sources, too. Don't forget the satire.
Oh, right. The satire, which is amazing.
Yeah.
We're using all of this to answer one core, mind-bending question. How did a movement born from the intense, rigid, highly specific theological debates of the 16th century Protestant Reformation morph into a generic, consumer-driven subculture?
And, even if you aren't religious, you really need to understand this mechanism.
Definitely. Why is that?
Because what the sources reveal is a masterclass in how massive cultural movements or institutions and even political factions lose their defining characteristics when they prioritize modern marketing over historical substance.
So it's about institutional drift.
Exactly. The mechanism of institutional drift is universal. When you look at the synthesis of these sociological studies, you realize that the forces that hollowed out this specific religious movement, well, they're the exact same forces that operate on our secular institutions today.
That is so fascinating.
It's a profound study on the sociological impact of modern consumerism. We are essentially tracing how the pursuit of relevance ultimately leads to total assimilation.
Total assimilation. Okay, so to understand how we arrived at the plain cracker, we really have to look at the original recipe.
We have to go back to the beginning.
Right, so the sources point us back to the 16th century, to the classical Protestant Reformation. And it seems like the term evangelical, which comes from the Greek word euangelion, meaning gospel or good news, it originally meant something incredibly specific, not just a vague cultural identity.
The precision of the term in the 16th century cannot be overstated. During the Reformation, the term was utilized primarily to distinguish Orthodox Protestants, specifically the early Lutherans, from Roman Catholics.
Okay, so it was a very clear dividing line.
Very clear. To call yourself evangelical meant you held to a very distinct, rigorous set of theological convictions.
It wasn't about like a feeling or a voting block.
No, not at all. It meant an intense, uncompromising focus on divine grace, justification by faith alone, and the supreme, ultimate authority of Scripture over church tradition or papal decrees.
The sources actually use the phrase magisterial movement to describe this early era. I'm guessing that means it wasn't just some grassroots underground thing.
Right.
Like it was tied to the magistrates, to physical towns and cities, deeply embedded in the civic life of the time.
That is a crucial distinction.
Yeah.
It was geographically and institutionally rooted.
Okay.
Being a classical evangelical meant you were part of a covenant community, and you were bound by highly detailed, written confessions of faith.
So you couldn't just make it up as you go.
Exactly. You belonged to a local parish. You didn't just float from church to church based on which pastor gave the most entertaining sermon. Your theology was tied to the soil and the local church governance.
But that rigid, locally rooted recipe undergoes a massive shift when we cross into the 18th century.
It does.
We hit the transatlantic awakenings. We have figures bursting onto the scene like George Whitefield, John and Charles Wesley, and Jonathan Edwards.
Right, the Great Awakening.
Yeah, and the whole mechanism of how people engage with religion seems to change from something institutional to something highly, highly personal.
Well, the Awakenings introduced this really powerful experiential dimension. Figures like Edwards and Whitefield brought the concept of being born again to the absolute forefront.
Which is a phrase we still hear all the time today.
Exactly. But prior to this, your religious identity was often seen as something you were born into, localized in your parish.
Right.
But Whitefield, he actually took preaching out of the church building and into the open fields. He demanded a personal, individual response.
So he's directly appealing to the crowd outside the institution.
Yes. He intertwined religious revival with an intense, subjective experience of conversion.
So it shifts from, I am a member of this church and I assent to this historic creed, to I have had a profound personal encounter with the divine.
That's the shift, yeah.
But the sources are really careful to note that they didn't throw out the theological recipe book yet, right? I mean, Edwards was notoriously intellectual.
Oh, incredibly intellectual. They retained the deep theological rigor of the Reformation.
Okay, so the core was still there.
Yes, they were still deeply confessional. They simply added the requirement that this objective truth must be subjectively felt and experienced.
I see.
They gave the gospel a unique responsiveness to the individual, but they were still operating within strict theological boundaries. The recipe was still complex, they just changed how it was served.
Okay, so the real fracture, the moment the recipe starts getting, locked in a vault, that happens later.
Much later.
We jump forward to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the sources highlight the fundamentalist, modernist controversy as the great dividing line of American Protestantism.
It really was the defining moment.
It seems like the movement just split into two completely different survival strategies in the face of modern science and philosophy.
Right, because modernity essentially forced a crisis.
How so?
Well, on one side you had the modernists, or theological liberals, and their strategy was accommodation.
Meaning they just adapted to the new culture?
Basically. They decided that to survive the modern age, they needed to discard historic orthodoxy. Things like miracles, the physical resurrection, the literal virgin birth.
Oh, wow. So they just tossed out the supernatural stuff entirely?
Mostly, yes. They retained the ethics of Christianity, what became known as the social gospel, focusing heavily on outward social action, poverty relief, institutional reform. But they gutted these supernatural elements.
And then on the other side, you have the fundamentalists, who essentially said absolutely not.
Exactly.
They draw a line in the sand over the fundamentals of the faith.
Hence the name.
Right. And the sources specifically mention their fierce defense of doctrines like penal substitutionary atonement.
Yes, a very key doctrine.
Let's unpack that term a bit because it sounds like legal jargon, but the sources say it's central to their identity. I'm assuming penal relates to penalty or the law, and substitutionary means someone taking your place.
You've isolated the exact mechanism. It is the legal courtroom framework for understanding the cross. The doctrine asserts that humanity broke a divine, objective moral law, and a literal penalty was owed to satisfy perfect justice.
So a debt had to be paid.
Exactly. Jesus steps into that cosmic courtroom, takes the punishment as a substitute, and legally clears the debt. For the fundamentalists, this wasn't just a metaphor or a helpful moral story.
It was literal.
It was the objective, non-negotiable mechanism of salvation. To lose that was to essentially lose Christianity itself.
So the fundamentalists are holding the line on the original recipe, but then they run into a massive public relations buzzsaw.
A huge one.
The sources point to the 1925 Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee, as this massive psychological and cultural turning point.
The Scopes trial was a total watershed moment.
Right. John Scopes was put on trial for teaching human evolution in a state-funded school.
And the fundamentalists were represented by William Jennings Bryan, who was a towering political figure at the time, while the defense brought in Clarence Darrow.
But the sources say what truly mattered wasn't the legal verdict. I mean, Scopes was actually found guilty and fined, right?
Yes, he lost the trial. But it was the cultural verdict that mattered.
Because the media, specifically journalists like H.L. Mencken, painted the fundamentalists as backward, uneducated, anti-science hillbillies.
They absolutely destroyed them in the press. The cultural prestige of holding orthodox theology just evaporated overnight.
Wow. So they won the legal battle, but completely lost the cultural war.
Yes, and the psychological impact of that media mockery was devastating. Fundamentalism rapidly lost its cultural high ground.
What did they do?
Feeling besieged by a hostile secular culture and also a liberalizing mainline church, the movement retreated.
They just packed up and left.
Pretty much. They pulled back from northern urban centers and elite universities. They became a largely southern rural movement.
They essentially built a parallel universe.
That's a great way to put it.
If Harvard and Yale, which, the sources point out were originally founded by Orthodox Protestants, if they didn't want them, they would just build their own independent Bible colleges.
Right. They built their own publishing houses, their own radio stations. They developed this militant separatism, this really intense phobia of anything deemed worldly.
It was a survival mechanism.
It was. But the cost of that survival was intellectual isolation. They stopped engaging with broader culture, with science, literature.
They took the theological recipe, locked it in a fortress in the woods, and just refused to engage with anyone outside the walls.
Exactly. Which sets the stage perfectly for the mid-20th century.
Right, because a new generation looks at this fortress in the woods and realizes it's a dead end.
It wasn't sustainable.
The sources introduced the birth of neo-evangelicalism as this deliberate, calculated rescue mission. We have figures like Carl F. H. Henry, Harold John Akinga, and of course the most famous of all, a young Billy Graham.
Right, and these leaders were theologically conservative. They believed the fundamentals, but they were deeply embarrassed by the anti-intellectualism and the angry separatism of their parents' generation.
They wanted out of the woods.
They wanted a massive course correction. The goal was to build a new coalition that retained fundamentalism's commitment to biblical authority, but completely discarded its cultural isolationism.
They wanted a seat at the cultural table again?
Exactly.
But, here is the massive logistical problem they faced. To build a massive trans-denominational coalition that has actual cultural power, you have to find common ground among wildly different groups.
It's incredibly difficult.
You were trying to unite Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Pentecostals, so they had to adopt a minimalist approach to doctrine.
They had to figure out the absolute bare minimum a person had to believe to be in the club.
Exactly. And the sources point to a specific historian who mapped this out.
Yes. British historian David Bebbington. He formalized how we understand this minimalist framework. It's known as the Bebbington Quadrilateral.
The Bebbington Quadrilateral. Okay, break that down for us.
He identified 4 core traits that function as the lowest common denominator for this new evangelical identity.
Okay, what's the first one?
First is conversionism. That's the belief that lives need to be fundamentally changed, that you must be born again.
Right, going back to the Great Awakening.
Exactly. Second is activism, which is the expression of the gospel in effort, particularly evangelism and eventually social action.
Makes sense.
Third is biblicism, a particular regard for the Bible and taking it seriously as the ultimate authority.
Okay, and the fourth?
And fourth is crucicentrism, a stress on the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross.
Okay, so conversionism, activism, biblicism, and crucicentrism. On paper, that sounds great. It sounds like a really solid, unified front.
It functioned brilliantly as a sociological unifier for a few decades.
But
it contained a fatal flaw. By minimizing doctrine to build a giant tent, you inherently compromise the structural integrity of the tent itself.
Oh, right. Because when you look at what they had to ignore to keep that peace, it is staggering.
You lose a tent poles.
You really do. The sources highlight how incredibly divisive issues were deliberately swept under the rug. Take a publication like Christianity Today, founded in 1956 by Billy Graham and Carl F. H. Henry to be the intellectual flagship of the movement.
Right.
The editors pragmatically decided to just ignore debates over church governance.
Which was a huge deal historically.
Yeah. Should a church be run by bishops, by a regional presbytery, or by independent autonomous congregations? They wouldn't touch it.
So divisive.
What about the sacraments? Infant baptism versus believer's baptism? Communion as a means of grace versus just a simple memorial? Sidelined.
Because if you take a hard stance on any of those historic secondary doctrines, you alienate a massive chunk of your coalition.
So they just pretended those issues didn't matter.
Right. And historian D.G. Hart offers a profound critique of this exact pragmatism. He argues that this minimalist approach birthed an institutional colossus. It fueled the rise of massive parachurch organizations.
Okay, let's define parachurch for the listener, because that term is really central to understanding the modern landscape.
Yeah.
It basically means an organization that operates alongside the church, outside of normal denominational structures, right?
Correct.
Like the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, Campus Crusade for Christ, focus on the family.
Yes. They are independent, specialized ministries, and they are often run more like modern corporations than historical religious bodies.
Right.
And Hart argues that by attempting to forge an identity out of disparate traditions using these parachurch groups, neo-evangelicalism created an identity that, theologically speaking, doesn't actually exist in history.
Wow. He calls it the wax nose of 20th century American Protestantism. I love that imagery.
It's perfect. It's an abstraction.
Yeah, wax nose can be shaped, molded, twisted into whatever the culture or the political moment demands because it has no underlying bone structure.
None at all. It stopped being defined by historic confessions and started being defined entirely by the personalities it admired.
And the forces point out that the shift from institutional fidelity to personality cults is the defining marker of this era.
Yes, George Marsden, a really prominent historian of religion, he captured this perfectly with a famous quip.
Oh, I remember this quote.
He observed that an evangelical essentially became anyone who likes Billy Graham.
Anyone who likes Billy Graham
Well,
is wild.
When your identity is tethered to a charismatic individual rather than a historic creed or a local community, you have fundamentally altered the sociology of the religion.
It totally reminds me of the transition from going to a local independent movie theater to subscribing to a giant streaming service.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
In the parachurch model, your religious identity no longer lives in a physical building with people you actually know. Believers were suddenly held together by celebrity preachers, national radio broadcasts, stadium rallies, massive publishing houses.
It's disembodied.
Completely. And here is the danger of the streaming service model. If you don't like the flavor of one ministry, or if the pastor says something that challenges you, you just turn the dial.
You cancel your financial subscription and fund another one.
Exactly. You completely bypass the accountability, the spiritual discipline, and the communal friction of the local church.
The consumer becomes the ultimate authority. You are curating your own religious experience based entirely on your personal preferences.
So if identity is no longer tied to a local church, but to these massive, well-funded parachurch groups and celebrity figures, how do local congregations survive?
It's a real crisis for them.
I mean, a guy preaching to 100 people in a traditional building simply cannot compete with the media saturation, the concert-level production, and the marketing budgets of these national ministries.
They cannot compete unless they change their business model.
And according to the sociological data in our sources, they adapted by systematically dropping their historical baggage to attract the modern consumer.
This is the pivot where the movement actively begins to erase its own distinctives.
This is where the marketing genuinely takes over the theology.
It really does.
We enter the late 20th century and see the explosive rise of the non-denominational megachurch and the seeker-sensitive model. The sources detail how churches began scrubbing denominational labels from their signage.
Oh, literally taking them down.
Words like Baptist, Presbyterian, or Lutheran were sandblasted off the buildings or removed from the websites.
And the rationale behind this was entirely driven by church growth experts and market research. The research indicated that historical denominational labels were viewed by the unchurched consumer as marketing liabilities.
Liability.
They signaled division, old-fashioned tradition, or theological narrowness. The goal was to remove all theological friction at the front door.
It's the ultimate corporate branding.
Yeah.
We see this in the secular world constantly. Look at what happened to tech company logos or fashion brands over the last 10 years. All the unique, quirky, historically distinct logos were replaced by the exact same generic, safe, sans serif font.
They all look the same now.
They did it so they could scale globally without offending any specific demographic. And that is exactly what happened to the modern church. It stopped being a covenant community bound by historic truth and became a vendor of religious goods and services, desperate not to alienate a potential customer.
By treating robust doctrinal formulations as too narrow or too dogmatic, the evangelical movement started generating focus group-tested slogans and highly produced emotional experiences at the expense of careful theological reflection.
But when you erase robust theology, you don't just get a neutral space, do you?
No, not at all. You create a profound vacuum, and sociological vacuums are always filled by the prevailing cultural ethos of the time.
And the sources have a very specific name for the filler that rushed into that vacuum. Sociologist Christian Smith ran massive, comprehensive studies on the religious beliefs of modern Americans, and he termed this new default religion Moralistic Therapeutic Deism, or MTD.
Smith's research is absolutely critical here.
What did he find?
He discovered that despite the massive infrastructure of evangelical youth groups, summer camps, and contemporary worship services, the actual functional theology being absorbed by the congregants had almost nothing to do with historic Christianity.
Wow.
It had been entirely replaced by MTD.
I really want to spend some time breaking down the 5 tenets of MTD because when you read them, it sounds like the mission statement of a generic life coaching seminar.
It really does. Let's go through them.
Okay, tenet number 1. A God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth.
Right, very generic deism. Nothing distinctly Christian there.
Tenet number 2. God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions.
Now notice the reduction there. The entire ethical demand of the universe is reduced to being nice.
Just be a nice person.
Exactly. It completely ignores biblical categories of holiness, righteousness, or radical self-sacrifice. It is a morality of middle-class politeness.
Okay, tenet number 3. The central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself.
Therapeutic.
Tenet number 4. God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem.
He is a cosmic butler.
A cosmic butler.
A divine problem solver on standby. You don't submit your life to him. You call him when your car breaks down or your marriage hits a rough patch.
And finally, tenet number 5. Good people go to heaven when they die.
Again, totally bypassing any need for grace, atonement, or salvation.
It's just, if you're generally a nice person, you get the reward.
Theologian Michael Horton evaluates the sociological data and delivers a devastating critique in his book, Christless Christianity.
Christless Christianity. That is a heavy accusation.
It is. He looks at MTD and argues that the modern evangelical church didn't necessarily become classically liberal in the way the modernists did in the 1920s.
Right.
They didn't write academic papers denying the resurrection. Instead, they became something far more insidious. They became theologically vacuous.
I'm guessing Horton doesn't mean they literally stopped saying the word Jesus during the service. I assume he means they demoted him.
Demoted him, yes.
Like he stops being the cosmic savior of your eternal soul and just becomes a life coach to help you get that promotion or feel better about your week.
You've hit the nail on the head. They kept the vocabulary but completely redefined the dictionary.
Oh, wow.
Horton argues that this generic therapeutic approach accidentally resurrects ancient, historically condemned heresies without anyone in the building even realizing it.
Wait, accidentally resurrecting heresies? Like what?
Well, by focusing entirely on being nice and the idea that good people go to heaven, the modern church accidentally resurrected Pelagianism.
Okay, let's define Pelagianism. There was a debate from the 4th century between Pelagius and Augustine, right?
Yes, exactly. Pelagianism essentially teaches that human beings are fundamentally good, not inherently fallen, and that we have the natural ability to fulfill God's commands without needing divine grace.
So it's the ultimate spiritual bootstraps myth?
Yes. It elevates human moral effort over divine rescue. And MTD is fundamentally Pelagian.
And Horton also points out that by focusing so heavily on feeling good, being happy, and subjective emotional experiences, the church resurrects Gnosticism.
Right. Gnosticism was another early heresy that elevated subjective, internal, mystical knowledge, like an inner divine spark, over objective, historical truth and the physical reality of the incarnation.
Oh, so when the modern worship service prioritizes feeling the Spirit over understanding the text, or when individuals elevate my truth and personal peace over historic doctrine, they are repeating the Gnostic error.
Exactly. Jesus is no longer the historical, physical, substitutionary atonement for sin. He is a concept, an energy, a therapeutic asset.
The sources point to the prosperity shift as the ultimate realization of this. They highlight figures like Joel Osteen.
Oh, yes, the prosperity gospel.
You look at that model, and the biblical categories of sin, law, repentance, and gospel are entirely replaced with therapeutic self-help, positive thinking, and behavioral modification.
Completely replaced.
The message is no longer about reconciling a holy God with sinful humanity. It's about fulfilling your personal dreams and achieving your best life right now.
And here is the crucial mechanism behind why this shift occurred so easily. Because generic evangelicalism deliberately severed its ties to the rigorous historical doctrines and confessions of the past to maximize its market appeal, It lost its theological antibodies.
I love that phrase, theological antibodies.
It's an apt biological metaphor. And institutions' historic creeds and confessions act as an immune system. They identify foreign, toxic ideas and reject them to protect the host.
So by stripping away that complex theology to serve the plain cracker, the evangelical movement destroyed its own immune system.
Yes, making it entirely unable to resist the infection of American therapeutic culture.
So the restaurant is now serving plain crackers, but the cracker isn't just tasteless, it has fundamentally changed the nutritional profile of the meal.
It has zero nutrition.
But to truly understand how this therapeutic mindset infiltrated the church so deeply, we have to look outside the church walls. We have to examine the sociological forces of modernity itself.
This is where the analysis by theologian and sociologist David F. Wells in his book No Place for Truth becomes absolutely vital.
Okay, what does he say?
Wells looks at the macro-level shifts in society. He argues that evangelicalism, a movement that supposedly prided itself on standing against secularization and worldliness, was actually conquered by modernity from the inside out.
So they won the cultural battles on paper but lost the war in their own minds.
Precisely.
The mechanism Wells focuses on is what he calls the homelessness of the soul. Let's spend some time on this because it explains the psychology of the modern consumer.
A profound concept.
He's talking about modernization.
Right.
Specifically, the massive transition from agrarian rural societies to urbanization, triumphant capitalism, invasive technology, and mass media.
Think about the psychological difference between living in a small 18th century agrarian village versus a modern anonymous metropolis. In the village, your identity is given to you. It is rooted in your family name, your trade, your local geography, and your local parish. You don't have to invent who you are. You are embedded in a web of historical and communal relationships.
But when the Industrial Revolution hits and mass urbanization occurs, you move to the city. You are suddenly severed from the soil, from the extended family, from the local church. You are anonymous.
And for the first time in human history, you have to manufacture your own identity. You are psychologically homeless.
And the proliferation of mass consumption and mass advertising swoops in to solve that identity crisis.
Yes. Advertising trains the human mind to view its internal desires as the ultimate truth.
So it creates what Wells calls a cliché culture.
Exactly. In a mass market society driven by branding, depth, objective truth, and rational absolutes are simply too heavy to sell. They are emptied of meaning and replaced by slogans, sound bites, and a subjective, inward-focused obsession with the self.
So the individual is trained by the secular economy to view themselves as a consumer who curates their identity through the products they buy and the media they consume.
They apply that exact same logic to religion.
Right. Wells argues that evangelicals, who were seeking a refuge from these corrosive acids of modernity, instead of finding an anchor in transcendent objective truth, ended up adopting the exact same consumer playbook.
They turned inward. They refashioned their faith into a religion of the self.
And that fundamentally changed the leadership structure of the institution, didn't it?
Completely.
If the congregation views church as a place to consume a religious product that makes them feel good about their curated identity, a pastor who preaches hard, objective truths about sin, judgment, and self-denial is suddenly bad for business.
He is a liability to the growth of the organization.
So we see a massive shift in the professionalization of the pastorate. The job description morphs. Pastors historically functioned as theologians. Their primary job was to ground their communities in transcendent truth, to study the ancient languages, to administer the sacraments, and to prepare people for death.
But under the pressures of consumerism, they morphed into a hybrid of corporate CEOs and psychological therapists.
They became managers of religious enterprises.
The script for pastoral study shifted away from rigorous exegesis of the Bible or the historic writings of the church and shifted towards sociology, marketing, and human experience. They had to become experts in customer retention.
The historical irony here is just profound. You look at the timeline we've discussed. Conservative evangelicals fought tooth and nail in the 1920s against theological liberalism, specifically to preserve objective truth.
They endured public mockery to defend the fundamentals.
But then, by the 1980s and 90s, their descendants voluntarily surrendered that exact same objective truth, not because of a new scientific discovery or a grand philosophical argument, but simply for marketing, popularity, and numerical growth.
It is a devastating irony. They fought liberalism at the front door, only to let consumerism in through the back door. They fully embraced the capitalist, consumerist paradigms of the age to stay relevant. and in doing so became entirely irrelevant as a countercultural force.
And the surrender of historical roots, this adoption of consumer pragmatism, leads us perfectly into the great historical ironies that absolutely plague the modern movement. The sources highlight several massive contradictions that occur when an institution loses its memory.
The first major irony we need to dissect is the subversion of a core Reformation principle, sola scriptura, or scripture alone.
Right. In the 16th century, sola scriptura was the bedrock. It was the radical idea that the Bible is the supreme, ultimate authority standing over and above papal decrees, church councils, or human tradition.
If a tradition contradicted the text wins.
But our sources show how this noble concept mutated into a hyper-individualistic biblicism in the modern era.
It devolved into the incredibly popular modern evangelical maxim, no creed but the Bible.
Which sounds incredibly pious on the surface. It sounds like you are honoring the text above all else.
But as theologian Karl R. Truman points out in his brilliant analysis, the creedal imperative, claiming to have no creed, is actually logically self-defeating.
Because everyone has a creed, whether they write it down or not. A creed is simply the Latin word credo, I believe.
Yes.
It is your synthesized understanding of what the Bible actually teaches. When you read a verse, how you interpret it is your creed.
Precisely. So when a church or a pastor proudly claims no creed but the Bible, they aren't actually freeing themselves from human tradition. They are simply hiding their tradition. They are subjecting the entire congregation to the unwritten, improvised, unscrutinized private creed of the charismatic leader at the front of the room.
Which means an unwritten creed is basically just a dictatorship of the pastor's current mood.
Yeah.
If the rules aren't written down and agreed upon historically, the pastor can claim that whatever he thinks today is what the Bible says, and you have no objective standard to challenge him.
It is worse than a dictatorship. It is a moving target.
Right.
The original reformers understood this danger intimately. They viewed written confessions as a norma normata, a ruled rule.
Okay, what does that mean?
The confession was subordinate to Scripture, which is the norma normans, the ruling rule, but the confession was absolutely necessary to prevent subjective chaos.
So it's a boundary.
Yes. A written creed isn't a cage, it is a protective wall for the congregation. It provides public accountability. To abandon it under the guise of just me and my Bible is to invite the tyranny of personal authority, masking the pastor's own opinions as direct divine revelation.
That is fascinating. The attempt to elevate the Bible actually subjects the congregation to the whim of the pastor, which leads right into the second irony, involving the inerrancy battles.
The battle for the Bible. In the mid-20th century, conservative evangelicals spent vast amounts of intellectual energy and institutional capital defending the doctrine of inerrancy.
This is the belief that the biblical text, in its original manuscripts, is completely without error in everything it affirms, including history and science.
Right. They fought massive denominational civil wars over this. They purged seminary professors who denied it. They formed new institutions, like Fuller Seminary originally, to defend a pristine, perfect text.
But the sources point out the irony. They fought to defend the theoretical perfection of the text. But then from the pulpit, they used a mechanism called adaptive reading to practically void that exact same authority.
Yes, adaptive reading.
Write that down.
Adaptive reading is when you take an ancient objective text and forcefully twist it to fit modern psychological needs, secular ideologies, or therapeutic models.
Oh, I see.
So a pastor might fiercely defend the historical reality of the story of David and Goliath, insisting it really happened without error. But then when he preaches it on Sunday, he doesn't preach it as a historical narrative about God's redemptive plan. He preaches it as a metaphor for defeating the giants of anxiety in your career.
So they defended the text intellectually, but surrendered the pulpit to therapeutic moralism. They fought for a perfect book and then used it as a prop for a self-help seminar.
Exactly. It means absolutely nothing to defend the theoretical perfection of a text if your interpretive methods render it practically meaningless in the lives of the congregation.
The third great irony the sources examined is the political capture of the movement. And looking at the sociological data from the 1980s all the way through to the 2016 election, the sources point out an objective, measurable shift.
Yes, the data is very clear.
Now, crucial rule check for you, the listener. We have to explicitly pause and state that this deep dive is not taking a political side. We are purely reporting the historical and sociological data from the sources. Regardless of where anyone sits on the political aisle, the data shows that the theological term evangelical became largely synonymous with a specific partisan voting bloc.
Right. The data specifically highlights the rise of the moral majority in the 80s, culminating in the stat that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in 2016.
The term shifted in the public consciousness from denoting a theology of grace and biblical authority to denoting a nationalist political agenda. So, how does a movement that started with such rigorous theological boundaries become so vulnerable to total political capture?
The mechanism is the exact vacuum we discussed earlier. When you systematically erase your historic theological distinctives, your movement is left without an anchor.
A ship without a sail.
Classical Protestant theology historically views believers as alien sojourners. They belong primarily to the city of God while temporarily residing in the city of man. There is a healthy distance between the church and the state.
But without that robust historic theology, modern generic evangelicals increasingly conflated their religious identity with American nationalism.
They replaced the concept of the global historic church with the concept of the nation.
And historian D.G. Hart points out a profound secondary irony here regarding the political philosophy of conservatism itself.
He does.
True classical conservatism, the philosophy of Edmund Burke, for example, values prudence, limits organic order, and deeply understands original sin and human fallibility. It is suspicious of utopian schemes to perfect society.
But modern evangelicals, drawing on the emotional activist energy of their 18th and 19th century revivalist roots, didn't act like classical conservatives.
Oh, they do?
They adopted a utopian, progressive zeal. They just applied that progressive zeal to right-wing causes. They wanted to legislate morality, transform culture from the top down, and build a righteous empire right now through political power.
It became a legalistic political Christianity that practically elevates partisan works and nationalistic fervor over historic Christian doctrine.
The identity became so intertwined that for many, stepping outside the partisan line was viewed as a greater heresy than denying a tenet of the Nicene Creed.
Wow. So we have a movement tangled in a web of theological contradictions. They preach Scripture alone, but rely on pastoral dictatorships. They defend a perfect Bible, but use it for therapeutic self-help. They claim a kingdom not of this world, but seek absolute political dominance.
It's a mess of contradictions.
When an institution is this mired in contradiction, and the culture inside the institution is comfortable and complacent, direct, logical argumentation often fails. You can write all the academic papers you want, but people won't read them.
Logic fails when the audience is asleep. And when logic and theology fail to wake people up, what tool do reformers historically reach for?
They reach for mockery. They reach for satire. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating literary angles in our sources, the architecture of absurdity. Because satire isn't just a modern, secular tool used by late-night hosts. The sources demonstrate that it has a massive, rigorous biblical and historical pedigree.
Oh, absolutely. Satire is a primary rhetorical weapon used throughout the biblical narrative to tear down idolatry. You see this vividly in the Old Testament.
Let's hear an example.
Well, the prophet Elijah doesn't just calmly debate the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. He uses scatological, absurd mockery against them. When their God doesn't answer, Elijah suggests that Baal is perhaps deep in thought, or asleep, or, as the original Hebrew implies, relieving himself in the restroom.
Oh, wow. He actually said that.
Yes. He uses shocking absurdity to expose the total pathetic impotence of their theology.
And Jesus himself used preposterous exaggerations to mock the legalism of the religious elites. He told the Pharisees they were straining a tiny gnat out of their drink to remain ceremonially clean, while simultaneously swallowing a whole unclean camel.
Right.
It's an absurd, comical image designed to highlight their hypocrisy. Or having a giant wooden structural beam sticking out of your eye while complaining about a tiny speck of dust in someone else's. And the Apostle Paul used biting, almost savage sarcasm in his letters, particularly in Galatians, when dealing with legalists.
So there is a divine precedent for using the absurd to shatter complacency. Historically, we see this tradition carried forward in the Augustan age with writers like Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift.
Swift is brilliant.
Yes. Swift's modest proposal used horrific, absurd logic to clear away the rubbish of political squalor and force the British to look at how they were treating the Irish. Later, Victorian sages like Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin utilized a specific literary device to do this.
The sources mention literary scholar Wolfgang Kaiser, who calls this concept the grotesque.
The grotesque. That's the deliberate use of absurd, unnatural, or jarring analogies to shock audiences out of their moral or intellectual slumber. By transforming contemporary, accepted reality into something weird or absurd, you force the audience to see the underlying spiritual or intellectual decay they have grown accustomed to ignoring.
And modern digital satire does the exact same thing to the evangelical church. It uses the grotesque to expose a plain cracker. The sources highlight several digital media projects, but the most prominent is the Lutheran Satire project.
Oh, their videos are incredible.
They have this incredibly famous animated video called St. Patrick's Bad Analogies, and it perfectly encapsulates the entire crisis of the seeker-sensitive church in about 3 minutes.
It is a brilliant distillation of the theological problem. Set the scene for the listener.
Okay, so imagine the historical St. Patrick in ancient Ireland, trying to explain the incredibly complex, transcendent doctrine of the Trinity to two simple Irish peasants. But the joke is, he doesn't use the historic creeds. He doesn't use the carefully debated language of the early church councils.
No, he tries to sound relevant. He uses the exact, modern, folksy analogies you hear in thousands of seeker-sensitive sermons every Sunday.
Exactly. He tells the peasants that the Trinity is like water, which can exist as solid ice, liquid water, or invisible steam. Or he says it's like the sun, which provides a star, light, and heat. Or it's like a single man who functions as a father to his kids, a husband to his wife, and an employer at his job.
And what makes the sketch so sharp is the reaction of the peasants.
The uneducated peasants immediately start yelling at him, pointing out that he is committing ancient, historically condemned heresies. They tell him that his water and his man with 3 jobs analogies are actually modalism. Let's break that down, because it's a great example of why precision matters. Why is the water analogy a heresy?
Modalism is the ancient error that suggests God is just one single person who puts on 3 different masks or operates in 3 different modes depending on the situation, sometimes acting as Father, sometimes as Son, sometimes as Spirit.
So it's just one guy changing hats.
Exactly. It denies that the 3 persons are distinct, co-eternal, and interacting with each other. If modalism is true, then when Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was basically just talking to himself.
Yeah.
The historic church condemned it because it destroys the relational nature of God.
So St. Patrick tries another one, the Son analogy, and they yell at him for committing Arianism, the heresy that the Son is a created byproduct of the Father, not co-equal. Why is this video so devastatingly funny, but simultaneously so tragic?
It is tragic because it exposes a terrifying, objective reality about the modern church landscape. The generic evangelical church abandoned precise, historical, creedal language because they thought it was boring, too intellectual, or a barrier to market entry.
They wanted to be accessible.
Right. They wanted to sound relevant. But in doing so, they accidentally preach condemned heresies from the pulpit every single Sunday, completely unaware of their own heterodoxy. They literally do not have the theological vocabulary to know that they are wrong.
They threw out the recipe,
Shout.
started baking whatever sounded good, and accidentally poisoned the food.
Well put.
The sources also point to broader institutional parodies, like the fictional Landover Baptist Church. This is a brutal, long-running satire that pushes the mega-pastor model to its absolute authoritarian extreme. It exposes the financial grift, the spiritual abuse, and the cult-like atmosphere that inevitably ferments when a celebrity pastor has absolute power and zero denominational oversight.
And we also see parodies targeting the aesthetics of the movement. There are countless videos mocking the Sunday morning experience. They perfectly replicate the cool, emotionally distant pastor with the soul patch, the concert-grade laser lighting, the fog machines, and the highly calculated, emotionally manipulative chord progressions played by the worship band.
They show the lead singer whispering into the mic, closing his eyes, while the synth pad swells in the background, specifically designed to manufacture an emotional release. By stripping away the religious language and just showing the bare mechanics of the production, the satire reveals that the modern worship service is functionally indistinguishable from a secular rock concert or a corporate motivational seminar.
It visually proves Michael Horton's thesis. Aside from the packaging and the vocabulary, there is very little happening in those environments that couldn't be entirely satisfied by attending a Coldplay concert or a secular self-help retreat. Satire does the heavy lifting of clearing away the theological rubbish. It smashes the idols of pragmatism and forces the observer to acknowledge the emptiness of the plain cracker.
But satire only deconstructs. It only tears down the absurd. Once the rubble is cleared, what do the sources say needs to be built in its place? because the answer isn't to just be cynical forever. And that brings us to the final proposed solution in our sources, the confessional remedy, anchoring the ship. Because the cure for a movement that has lost its soul isn't inventing a new, smarter model or hiring a better marketing firm.
No, the only cure for institutional amnesia is a radical, intentional return to history. The sources point heavily toward confessional theology.
We brought up Karl R. Truman earlier, and his argument for the creedal imperative is central here. He argues that the historic ecumenical creeds, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and the robust Protestant documents like the Westminster Confession or the Augsburg Confession aren't dead, dusty traditions meant to stifle the Spirit.
They are the exact opposite. They are life-saving boundaries. They function as a public constitution for the Church.
And a constitution provides two vital things. First, it provides absolute transparency for the members. If you walk into a confessional church, you know exactly what they believe down to the letter. There is no bait and switch. There is no hidden agenda. Second, and most crucially for the modern era, a written confession provides the ultimate mechanism of accountability that restrains pastoral tyranny.
That is the key. If a pastor in a confessional church starts drifting into therapeutic moralism or starts using the pulpit to push a partisan political agenda, the congregation has an objective, historical document they can point to and say, "You are violating the covenant we agreed upon." The pastor isn't a dictator. He is a servant bound by a historic standard that outlives him.
This push to recover historical roots found a major, highly symbolic focal point in April 1996. The sources describe a gathering at the Charles Hotel near Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
The location itself is steeped in historical irony. Harvard was originally founded by Orthodox Puritans specifically to train ministers in rigorous confessional theology. By 1996, it had long since drifted into complete secular humanism. It is a monument to institutional drift.
And right in the shadow of that drift, an organization called the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals gathered. This included heavy-hitting theologians and historians like David F. Wells, Michael Horton, and R.C. Sproul. They gathered to draw a definitive theological line in the sand. They drafted what became known as the Cambridge Declaration. Their goal was to reclaim the five solas of the Reformation and apply those 16th century principles directly to the 20th century problems we've been discussing.
Let's examine how they weaponize those ancient principles against modern consumerism. Take solus Christus, or Christ alone. In 1517, that was an argument against the mediation of priests and saints. But in 1996, the Cambridge Declaration used it to explicitly reject the modern demotion of Jesus. It rejects Jesus as a mere life coach, a therapeutic asset, or a symbol of political liberation. It reaffirms him as the objective, sole mechanism of cosmic salvation.
Then you have sola fide, faith alone, originally aimed at the system of indulgences, but the Declaration aims it directly at the modern health and wealth prosperity gospel and the moralistic therapeutic deism that says good people go to heaven. It condemns the idea that you can earn divine favor through positive thinking, seed faith offerings, or just being a generally nice middle-class citizen.
And perhaps most cuttingly, soli Deo Gloria, to the glory of God alone. The Alliance applied this principle to attack the man-centered, self-esteem-building, entertainment-focused worship that had taken over the megachurches. It asserts that the primary purpose of gathering is not consumer satisfaction, emotional manipulation, or market relevance, but the objective worship of a transcendent God.
When I look at all this data, the overarching conclusion is incredibly clear. True, enduring unity within any movement isn't found in a lowest common denominator. It isn't found in stripping away your identity until you become the plain cracker that offends no one. True unity is found in a robust shared confession of objective truth. The solution isn't to invent a brand new, cooler denomination. It's about resourcing local, existing communities to dig through the rubble and recover their own historic roots.
Which brings us to our final synthesis. When you look at the current landscape based on all these sociological and historical sources, you see that the massive mid-century evangelical experiment, this ambitious attempt to build a giant, politically powerful coalition based on minimal doctrine and maximal pragmatism, has fractured. The center could not hold. We are witnessing a massive, real-time bifurcation of the movement.
It is splitting in two wildly different directions.
Yes. On one side, you have a massive demographic that is completely disillusioned. They look at the hypocrisy, the political captivity, the spiritual abuse by unaccountable celebrity pastors, and the sheer intellectual shallowness of the therapeutic model, and they are done. They're fully deconstructing their faith, drifting into post-evangelical progressivism, or simply abandoning the institutions entirely to become secular nones. They realized the plain cracker wasn't feeding them, so they left the restaurant.
And on the other side,
On the other side, you have a smaller but intensely dedicated faction. These are believers who are fleeing the vacuousness, the fog machines, and the TED Talk sermons of the megachurches. They are actively seeking out the deep, historically rooted waters of Reformed, Lutheran, or Anglican confessionalism. They recognize that a local, geographically rooted church, bound by ancient confessions and accountable to history, is the only institution capable of resisting the corrosive sociological acids of modern consumerism.
which brings us right back to you, the listener.
Yeah.
We promised at the beginning that this journey mattered to you, regardless of what you believe on a Sunday morning, because this deep dive proves a universal sociological law. The integrity of any institution, whether it is a religious body, a global corporation, a political party, or a cultural movement, does not survive by adapting to the lowest common denominator of the market. When you try to be everything to everyone, you inevitably end up being nothing at all.
You lose your soul in the desperate pursuit of relevance. And once the soul is gone, no amount of marketing can manufacture it again.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week. We've seen how the ultimate attempt to make a specific, complex religious message perfectly relevant and palatable to modern consumer culture actually resulted in the complete, tragic erasure of the message itself. So look around. What other areas of our modern lives, our political discourse, our higher education system, our art, or even our own personal internal values, have we accidentally hollowed out and turned into plain crackers, just to make them easier to sell to the crowd?
A sobering question, and one that demands our attention.
Thank you for taking this massive deep dive with us today. Keep seeking the spice, don't settle for the plain crackers, and we will see you next time.